All right. Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, everyone.
Mark, can you just
I've done it.
Yep.
all right. Can you still hear me on the Zoom? Great. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. Those in person, those on the Zoom. If everybody has a book, there are books at the back if you don't have. So we are continuing today, following from last week. Our topic that we started was Chukot Hagoyim. And as we said last week, as there was some feedback, people prefer to go a little bit slower, go into more of the sources inside rather than covering more ground. So that's what we'll be doing. We spoke last week about the general principles of Chukot Hagoyim, and today we'll talk a little bit about some of the applications, some of the many varied questions, very practical, relevant questions which come up regarding Chukot Hagoyim. So just a quick recap in terms of what we said last week, in terms of the general rules and the principles of this prohibition. We know the Torah tells us, "B'chukotehem lo telechu," do not go in their ways, do not go in the chukot of the non-Jewish nations around you. The pshat in the psukim, as we saw, it's talking about the nations in Eretz Canaan. It's talking about the 7 nations there, talking about the nations in Eretz Mitzrayim. We'll talk about this a little bit more next week. There's an entire subcategory of Chukot Hagoyim, what's known as Darkei HaEmori. And this is the Mishnah, the Gemara gives us a whole list of certain prohibitions related to Darkei HaEmori. These are mostly things to do with superstitions, magic, sorcery, different things like that. Next week, we'll have an entire shiur about magic. So we'll go into more detail there. But in any event, and these are these chukim, these b'chukotehem that we cannot do. We said there are 2 ways of looking at this. It might be specific to those chukot of those nations, right? Darkei HaEmori certainly is. Of those nations at the time who had all sorts of idolatrous and immoral practices, or it might be something broader, something encouraging us not to emulate those ways, to have a unique identity. And we spoke about that last week. Obviously, right, we understand that when the Torah says don't emulate Chukot Hagoyim, it does not mean that anything in the world which the non-Jewish nations do that we cannot do. There's obviously a reason, and there's obviously criteria for this. Very interesting. I just want to share with you a Gemara in Sanhedrin, the end of the 4th parak. This does not appear in the books, but the Gemara in the end of the 4th parak, Daf Lamed Tet, in Sanhedrin, brings a contradiction between 2 psukim in Sefer Yechezkel. It says there was one pasuk that says, the Navi is rebuking Bnei Israel. He says, just like interestingly here it says Mishpatei Hagoyim and not Chukot Hagoyim, but in any event, it says like the statutes of the nations around you, you did not follow in their ways. And then it's seen as a rebuke. And then it says there is another pasuk which says Uchtiv, Mishpatei Hagoyim asher svivoteichem asitem, that you followed, that you emulated the ways, the statutes of the nations around you. So which is it? Are you meant to copy? Are you not meant to copy? Says the Gemara, Ki metukanim shebahem lo asitem, ki mekukalim shebahem asitem. It gives examples, it explains what it's talking about. It says we got it wrong. It says there are certain practices you should have kept, certain practices of kavod and certain things which you did not, and certain immoral practices which you did keep. So which are the ones that we're meant to, where are we meant to follow, where are we not meant to follow, or where is it not an issue? So we saw Tosfot last week. Tosfot told us that essentially we have to divide between those practices which are rooted and which are connected to Avodah Zarah, which we are certainly not allowed to emulate. There, Tosfot understands the main prohibition of Chukot Hagoyim related to Avodah Zarah, related to idolatry. We also saw the Maharik and the Ran, and this becomes the mainstream psak. The Ramah brings this down, where he says that there are 2 cases whereby, aside from the case of idolatry, but 2 cases where practices of the non-Jewish nations around us, which we cannot keep, which would fall under this prohibition. Now, category number 1 is, as it says, b'chukotehem, the language of chok. We know that chok means something we don't understand, something that makes no sense. If there is a practice that the nations around have which makes no sense, there is no logical reason for it. The only reason you're emulating it is because that's what they do and we want to be like them. That is going to be a problem. There's a reason for it. We might have thought of it by ourselves. That's going to be something else. And we saw a slight nuance. Is the problem with this because it has no reason means that it might have had a reason related to idolatry once upon a time? Or is it simply a case of there's no reason, you're just doing it to copy them? But that is one area. And the second one is if it's related to not just avodah zarah, but if it's related to prisut, if it's related to immorality, if it's going to lead to some sort of licentious behavior, that would be something which should be prohibited as well. And that is the opinion of the Rama. That is the opinion of most of the Rishonim, the Achronim. We mentioned as well the Vilna Gaon. You can't have a discussion of Chukot Hagoyim without mentioning the Gra. The Gra is extremely stringent in this prohibition. He goes even further. He says even if it has a reason, right, but if it's something that we wouldn't have thought of by ourselves, then it's something which we have to avoid. And again, the poskim discuss what exactly is included in this prohibition according to the Gra. But most of the poskim, again, that is a minority opinion. Most of the poskim go by what we said before, which is that so long as something, if it has a reason, it's not connected to idolatry, it's not connected to any sort of immoral practice, that would not be a prohibition, that would not fall under Chukot Hagoyim. So let's see some of the applications and some of the places where this comes up. So if you look in the book, we're now on page 101. Right, this is the same, this is still Shiur number 3, the same Shiur we looked at last week. If you look at source 101, page 101, source number 8, this is the Sifra, which is one of the Midrashei Halacha. And the Sifra says the following, commenting on the pasuk of, just waiting for them to get there on the Zoom. Yeah, so source number 8, commenting on the pasuk, B'chukotehem lo telechu, v'chi mai niach hakatov shelo amro, etc. In other words, I mentioned before the idea of Darkei HaEmori, all sorts of different practices. Some of them are listed by the Torah, some of them are listed later by Chazal, things related to idolatry, things related to superstition, right? Terrible things. You could see, what would they do? They would pass their children through fire. Different opinions, by the way, in the Rishonim as to what this means. There are those Rishonim who understand that it was a certain ceremony that they would do, certain ceremony of idolatry and of magic and whatever, where you had a row of fire and the children would have to walk through, in between. There are other Rishonim who understand, no, what it means, passing their children through fire, means what it sounds like, meaning sacrificing them. But either way, that's something that we cannot emulate. That's something which is forbidden. The Torah says that explicitly, and it gives other, it says chover chaver, etc. Again, we'll talk about this more next week, in terms of these specific prohibitions related to divination and such. But what is the Torah adding when it says b'chukotehem lo telechu? So says the Midrash, Uma Talmud lomar b'chukotehem lo telechu. Now the line in bold, shelo telchu b'nimosot shelahen b'dvarim hachakukin lahem. So not just these things, not just these specific examples, but anything which is a tradition, which is a law, which are their practices that you should not emulate. For example, Kagon teatriot v'karkasaot v'asterayot, like attending their theaters, circuses, and stadiums. Talk about this in a moment, because you probably realize the theaters, circuses, and stadiums in those days were different to what we have nowadays. They may have other problems, but that's something that we'll see. But that's what the Midrash says. Rabbi Meir Omer Elu Darkei Emori Shemanu Chachamim. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera adds, he says there are other things, for example, certain types of clothing, certain types of haircuts, as we alluded to last week. Okay, so that is the Midrash, that is the Sifra and source number 8. Let's skip now to let's talk a little bit more about these theaters and stadiums. So let's skip to page 108. Page 108, and just before we read these sources inside, I'll mention there's a fascinating Gemara in Megillah. Gemara Megillah Daf Vav tells us that in the future, the theaters and the stadiums of Sheba Edom, which are of the non-Jewish nations, it says Atidin Sarei Yehuda Le'omod B'Hem Torah L'Rabim. It says in the future, the Jewish people will come to these stadiums and use them to teach Torah to the masses. And you can't help but not think of the Siyumim of Daf Yomi. Right, every 7.5 years, it was recently, just a couple of years ago. You have these big stadiums in America and England, across the world. I don't know, people might have seen when they had the Siyum in England, in London. So it was in an arena next to Wembley Stadium, and there was a letter that was sent out after the Siyum by the operations manager, and she writes there the most amazing letter to see. She says, at first, the Siyum committee approached me. We had no idea what your event was. We had no idea what you were doing. Eventually, we started to learn it. We understood. It says that they have sold something like 7,000 tickets, 7,000 people. And she says there were three things, the language she uses, that blew me away, right? She says the following 3 points. She says, number one, in these stadiums, we have a room for, people can deposit any dangerous or inappropriate items. Normally, an event of this magnitude, we'd get 700 to 1,000 of these items. So we'd had not one. Whether that means people didn't bring them or didn't bother to deposit them, I don't know. But that's what she said. She says we didn't have one that was deposited. Number two, she says that this entire event, there was not a single incident of rowdy behavior, of drunkenness, etc. She says normally, she says, I've been here for 28 months. I've been at 300 events. This is the first time ever that there hasn't been a single incident like this. And number three, she says that the staff couldn't believe how many people came and said thank you. She said, we thought they were given an instruction. They had to come and thank the staff. She says, this never happens. So it's it's the small things you don't realize, but this is a tremendous Kiddush Hashem, something like this can do. But that is maybe a fulfillment of their prophecy of, coming and learning and teaching Torah in these stadiums and these theaters, etc. But let's go back to the prohibition. So we're on page 108. Source number 20 is the Rambam. The Rambam in the Sefer HaMitzvot. Here where he talks about Chukot Hagoyim, he says HaMitzvah Shloshim, the 30th prohibition. There's a mistake in the translation. It says 50th, but it should really be 30th. Shehizhiranu milechet b'darkei hakofrim v'mitnaheg b'minagotehem v'afilu b'mabushehem v'kibbutzehem b'moshava. Says we are forbidden from following in the ways of the deniers, of the heretics, going in their practices, from wearing the same sort of fashion, clothing, gathering in their halls. Ulashon Sifra, here he quotes the Midrash, which we saw, B'chukotahem lo telechu, shelo telchu b'nimosot shelahem, b'dvarim achakukim lahem, kagon te'aot, kakasaot, v'astiraot, not attending their theaters, circuses, arenas, etc. What are these places? Elohem minim min hamushavim shayu mitkabtzim bahem, so these are places where they would gather together, right? These words are borrowed nowadays, but these are places where they would gather together for idol worship. This was not just going and watching a show or going watching. I might say that sports nowadays is a form of idol worship, the way that people relate to it. But this was, bona fide idolatry, and that is what the Torah is warning us about. It says you can't build structures that are similar to those. The Sefer HaChinuch, at the bottom of the same page. Number 22, he says, "Kumo shamru b'sifra, b'chukotehem lo telechu, shelo telchu b'nimosot shelahem." Don't follow along in their customs, b'dvarim hachakukim lahem, kagon tetraot v'kakasaot v'astiraot, v'kol elohem minei schok. These are all types of frivolity. Shosim b'kibbutzehem, kshemitkabbtzim, when they gather together, lasot shigonot v'znut v'avodat ha'elilim. So you see all sorts of senseless activities, all sorts of znut, of licentiousness, and all sorts of avodah zarah. So that is clearly going to be forbidden, right? How does this apply nowadays? Does that mean, a person wants to go to the theater, a person wants to go to a modern day sports stadium, Wembley Stadium? Can you go for the Cup final, assuming it's not on Shabbat? So says the Igrot Moshe, Rav Moshe Feinstein, in source number 23, he says nowadays, this is not what the Midrash was talking about, right? Sports stadiums, nowadays, they don't have the same concerns. There's no avodah zarah. There's no znut. You're watching a game. He says there may be other problems. It may be a waste of time. It might be frivolity in that sense. But in terms of the strict prohibition of Chukot Hagoyim, says that would not apply over here. Have a look, page 109, right? The Igrot Moshe, source number 23. He says, "Im asur mitzad b'chukotehem lo telechu." Can one go to a sports stadium nowadays? He says, so those things which are called a theater, where you go and you watch a show, right? Or a stadium, sport. This does not apply. This is not what the Midrash was talking about. That is when they have a law, they have a practice, they have to do something where it has no reason, as we've explained. Now in bold, When there's a reason why they do it, the stadium has a reason. They go for enjoyment, for entertainment. He says, right? It's for frivolity. It's not idol worship. He says this is leitzanot. As I said, there are better ways to spend your time, but nonetheless, it's not forbidden to go there. A few years ago, there was Israel. I think it was Israel played against Scotland. There was a football match. This was quite famous. So Rav Leff was actually at the game. He was there with his family. He went and took his grandkids, and he was on the TV. The broadcasters didn't know who he was, but they saw there was somebody in the crowd who was sitting there reading a book. That's how they saw it. He was sitting learning Gemara, right? He went with his family, asked him to go. He wasn't interested. He's sitting and learning Gemara. So this was on the news. You had this close-up shot. What was amazing was to see the difference between the English commentators and the Israeli commentators when they saw this. What did the English commentators say? They said, he's not interested. He's reading a book. Have you got a good book there? Whatever. The Israeli commentator said, he must be saying Tehillim for the team. So that was but you can see clearly he also would have followed in the way of Moshe Feinstein. This is not b'chukotehem le'telechu, but there are maybe better ways to spend your time. Okay, that's in terms of stadiums. Rating that, and he continues. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein there, he explains. You can see that on page 109. Okay, over the page, the next issue. A lot of issues, as I said, which come up regarding this prohibition. Some may be surprising. Some are not agreed by everybody. But one, a very contentious issue in the Rishonim and really to our days is the minhag of kaparot. Kaparot on Erev Yom Kippur, where some people go and will take a chicken and or a fish or whatever it may be, spin it around your head and then donate that to tzedakah as a way of, as some people understand it, as a way of maybe transferring one's sins onto that object, or as a way of gaining atonement. One of the more interesting questions that I've been asked was that some people do kaparot with chickens, some people do it with money, and nowadays some people you don't. Who walks around with cash? You use a credit card, use your cell phone. I have been asked the shaila that if one does kaparot with credit card, do they have to spin the cell phone around their head? But that is but going back to this actual minhag, source number 24, the Beit Yosef, you'll see, was not necessarily such a fan of it. Beit Yosef in source number 24, page 110. Yeah, we've got it. He says, Yesh makomot shenoagin nishchot tarnagol lekapara. He says there are places that have this custom to go and to slaughter a chicken for kapara, and this is found already in the Chuvot of the Geonim. He says, so it's brought in different sources in the Rishonim. That a male should take a male chicken, a female, etc. And he says, Arashba katav b'tshuva. בעניין הכפרה שעושים לנערים בערב יום הכיפורים, מנהג זה פשוט בעילנו. He says, the Rashba says, this is the practice. ואף על פי ששמעתי מפי אנשים הגונים מאשכנז, שכל הבני ארצם עושים כן, I've heard that in Ashkenaz this is the practice, וגם שמעתי שנשאר רבנו היי, ואמר שכן נהגו. Right? When you have so many sources, when he's going on, you have to have so many Rishonim and so many sources to show that it's a valid practice. You can tell there's going to be somebody who says that it's not a valid practice. But he says, says Rashba, nonetheless, I have prevented this minhag. The Ramban said, this is part of Darkei Amori. This is not our custom. This is imitating the ways of certain superstitions that were in other nations, and therefore it is not appropriate. You can see, so there is a massive machloket here, which to this day, whether this is an appropriate practice or not. Was the source of this minhag of kaparot, was it in our sources? Was it copied from somewhere else, and it's therefore not appropriate? So the Shulchan Aruch in source number 25, he says, "Mashenu agim la'asot kapara be'erev Yom Kippurim nishchot tarnagol." Says Shulchan Aruch, you should prevent this minhag. It is not appropriate, should not be done. Says the Rama, יש מהגאונים שכתבו מנהג זה, וכן כתבו אותו רבים מן האחרונים, וכן נוהגים בכל מדינות אלו ואין לשנות, כי הוא מנהג ותיקין. Says Rama, no, this is a long established, this is the minhag, and so it should be continued. It's interesting that Rav Ovadia Yosef, over here in Shut Yechavedat, he actually defends the minhag, even though we know that Rav Ovadia in many places, in most places, went by the Psakim of Maran, by the Shulchan Aruch. Nonetheless, this was somewhere where he felt that this was a minhag, it was appropriate, and it should be kept. So to this day, where there's a machloket, and everybody follow the minhag which they have, or what is appropriate. Everybody agrees that to give tzedakah, there is no problem of that. That is not an issur of Chukot Hagoyim, and one can certainly give extra money to tzedakah in terms of before Yom Kippur. No, he says here there were different minhagim, that the boys would take a male chicken and the girls would take a female chicken. That's what he says. Okay. Yes. I'm sorry, I can't. The issue of cruelty to animals. So that's discussed as well. And there are, for those on Zoom who didn't hear, the question was, what about the issue of cruelty to animals? So the issue of cruelty to animals is one that is discussed regarding kaparot, right? There are those who, Tzar Ba'alei Chaim, I think we may get there later on in this volume as well. But Tzar Ba'alei Chaim is, according to most poskim, is an Isur D'Oraita. Those who say it's Rabbanan, but the more common opinion is that it's Isur D'Oraita, which means a Torah prohibition. We know that there are certain cases where there is a human need. So again, the question, what is the need, and to what extent? For example, shchita is allowed by the Torah, right? We're allowed to eat animals, and that is not considered tzar ba'alei chayim. It comes up in the context of medical experimentation, for example. All the Achronim discuss this. Or is experiments on animals, is that permitted, or is that a prohibition of tzar ba'alei chayim? Everybody would agree that where it's done, where it can be avoided, and then it should. If it's done for medical purposes, if it's something where it's going to lead to saving human lives, and the only way to do it, to get there, is to test the medicines on animals, then it would be permitted. So the question is, we're talking about something which is a religious ritual, right? Is there a need for this? Is this our minhag? Would that fall under the issue of tzar ba'alei chayim or not? So if you hold that this is really part of Chukot Hagoyim, and this is not this is a minhag which comes from there, and then it's not appropriate to do in any case, so certainly then tzar ba'alei chayim would be a consideration as well. If it is something that, however, which is and this is why there are many poskim nowadays who would oppose it as well. If you hold that it happened previously, and it's a minhag vatikin, as the Rama says, and it's something which therefore there's a need for, so then maybe that would be a separate discussion. But it's definitely an issue which is raised, and that which the poskim address. Okay, moving on to the next issue. As we said today, we're going through different practical applications. Page 112. Over here, we have a number of sources dealing with the issue of walking without a head covering. This would be a question for men, right? Nowadays, it is universal that that we cover our heads, whether it's a kippah or a hat, whatever it may be. It was not always that. It wasn't always that way. The source of this, if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, source number 27, he says asur lelech. It's based on the Gemara. He says asur lelech b'komas kufa. A person shouldn't walk completely upright. One should be somewhat subdued, as understanding a certain level of humility that one is underneath Hashem. And one should not walk 4 amot with one's head uncovered. The Taz over here in source number 29, he says the following. But if you look at the words of the Shulchan Aruch, he first says asur lelech b'koman zkufa. That first halacha says it's forbidden, and then it says v'lo yelech 4 amot b'giloi rosh, and don't walk 4 amot. It doesn't say it's asur, meaning strictly speaking, it may be that it was not a prohibition, but says the Taz in source number 29, he says, I think that there is a complete, absolute prohibition of this for a different reason. Because Okay, fashion has changed a lot since the times of the Taz as well. Nowadays, people don't really walk around with hats, and it's not so common. But once upon a time, everybody would wear a hat. And he says their laws, the practice now amongst the non-Jewish nations, is that when they sit down, they have to take off their hat. Sometimes you see this. You go into a place, you go into a fancy restaurant or shops or whatever. They make you take off your hat before you walk in, and things like that. So he says, "In Ken, this would be part of their prohibition. In other words, be part of Chukot Akum to take off the hat, and therefore one should keep it on. Always, one should keep one's head covered." He says, "Kol sheken b'chok zeh sheishtam tekisoy alosh moleh al yirat shamayim." All the more so, we have a reason for it. We have a reason for covering one's head. And he says, "Vaday yamchik atzmo b'zeh yoter mishal chukotehem." Therefore, one should distance himself from that more than other practices. The Mishnah Berurah says similarly. Rav Moshe Feinstein, again, on behalf of Igor Moshe, he says, actually, I don't think this is an issue of Chukot Hagoyim. He says, why are they taking off their hats? They're doing it because it's more comfortable. You sit down, you take off your hat. He says, you have a look. It's always interesting to see the Hebrew words, the English words. They write them in Hebrew. Source number 31, page 113, towards the bottom. Excuse me. Source number 31, towards the end, in bold, says Rav Moshe Feinstein, "Ein lecha yediah ברורה מזה, שיודעים שכל אנשי אמריקה וכן מדינות אירופה, הולכים ויושבים בבתים ובמשרדים, offices, right? They all sit in their homes and their offices, בראש מגולה, without a hat. Why? שרק להנאתם, ולא בשביל איזה אמונה באיזה עבודה זרה. This is not, they're not worshipping idolatry by taking their hat off. This is convenience, this is comfort, and therefore, removing one's head covering is not Chukot Hagoyim in that sense. Nonetheless, both Rav Moshe Feinstein says over the page, you can see Rav Vadia Yosef, nowadays it has become a universal practice that Jewish men cover their heads. That is halacha, and that is the minhag, and that is required. He does discuss, in a situation whereby there is a vow for the sake of one's employment, and one can't find. Times have changed as well. But where one can't have a job without a head covering, so he says strictly the letter of the law, there's room to allow it. It's not Chukot Hagoyim, but all other things being equal and under normal circumstances, it's not something one should do in terms of removing the head covering as such. Okay, a very, very, very controversial topic, which has been discussed.
They're very full.
So again, if the point is that one is covering, the question is why are we covering one's head? The reason is, as we've seen before, this is not Avodah Zarah. The Shulchan Aruch here is really based, it's already in the Gemara. The Gemara discusses that a person the same way, person should not walk completely upright, person should not walk with a bare head. It's brought in our sources. The reason for doing it is to understand that one has Kadosh Baruch Hu above you, it's out of humility, it's out of a religious reason. We're doing it for that reason. We're not doing it to copy them. If it was exact, if a person was to say, we're not going to wear kippot anymore, we're going to wear, the same hat which which the cardinals wear and the Pope, exactly the same thing, to copy them, that would probably be a problem. But it's just the source of having a head covering. There's a reason why we do it. It's not Avodah Zarah. It's not it doesn't fall under this category.
Were noblemen's dress.
Okay, so that's a different discussion. The truth is that nowadays, right, the dress that people wear, they're not doing it, certainly not doing it nowadays to copy anybody else. Meaning the only people who dress like that are the Hasidim. So therefore, that would not. Right. Again, we're the people now. How should we dress this way or that? We spoke a little bit about last week in terms of different forms of dress. If it's done for convenience, if it's done for kavod, that would be allowed. But certainly now it's not done in a way to copy, and that would not be prohibited. But the next question, which many poskim discussed, I alluded to this last week, is page 115. So there's a question of standing for the siren on Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron, right? This is something which we know that we have this is the practice on these 2 days. We have a minute or 2 minutes, whatever it is, where we stand, and those who perished, be it in the Holocaust, those who fell in defense of the state of Israel and in terror attacks. And so some have said, well, this custom comes from, this is not in our early sources, or if we go back and we look at the classical ancient sources, how do we honor the memory of those who passed away? We say Kaddish, we learn Mishnayot, we say Tehillim, right? Those are the ancient Jewish practices. This idea of standing, of having a moment's silence, this is something new, this is something modern, this is something which is taken from the practices in the non-Jewish world. So therefore, would it be a problem, or why would it not be a problem of Chukot Hagoyim? So page 115, source number 33, you have Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, who writes the following. He says, Amida bizman hatzfira lechalalei tzahal, yesh ba mitzvah kedosha shel zichron kvod hakedoshim. He says, this idea, this concept of standing at the time of the siren is a holy mitzvah, and it honors the memory of those who have fallen. He quotes Tosfot, who we saw last week, who say b'firosh, shelo kol ma shemasodar ben hagoyim yesh bo mishum b'chukotehem lo telech. As we've been discussing for the last year and a half, not everything which the non-Jewish nations do falls under this prohibition. If it's part of idolatry, if it makes no sense. It says all the more so when this is something which is done publicly. He says, first of all, this is not a prohibition of Chukot Hagoyim, because that's only when there is no reason for it, or it's idolatry. Here there is a reason for it. It's in order to honor the memory of the dead. He says, secondly, this is something which all of Am Yisrael, which is done. You're going to come along and say you're not participating. That is a question of Prisha Min HaTzibur, right? Another issue which is raised, and people have said, okay, you should stop. You have to stop learning to get, what about Bitul Torah? There are sources in the Gemara that talk about when you have Talmud Torah Derabim, the question, do we even stop to say, somebody sneezes? Can you stop to say La Briut? Again, halavai, we should be on the level that we don't stop for a second, to say La Briut, because we're so, we're so engrossed in our learning. There are people like that, and there's still, in our days, but very, very few and far between. And I once heard there was a shayla. They asked Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, if a person is sitting in a Beit Midrash and he's learning, right, and there is a minyan going on in that Beit Midrash, and do you have to stop your learning to answer Amen to Kaddish? Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said, I don't understand the question. You're sitting and learning. Why would you hear what's going on? Okay, there are people like that, but like I say, there are few and far between. But going back to our issue, page 116, see number 35, Rav Melamed in Pnei Halacha, he says, "Efshar losif shehilhul b'zichronam shel hakedoshim u'b'mitzvat mesirut hanefesh la'atzalat ha'am u'lekibush ha'aretz u'l'rov b'divrei Torah." He says, more than that, I'll tell you that stopping and thinking of the memories, right, and honoring those who, with Mesirat Nefesh, died in order to save Am Yisrael, in order to save Eretz Yisrael. He says that in itself is considered on some level thinking of words of Torah. He says, same as we saw before. And if you don't accept that, you don't believe me, at least, don't separate yourself from the community, from what everyone else is doing. And the truth is that in recent years, there has been a much more of a, coming together, the whole concept of Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaShoah as well, within other communities within Israel that previously did not mark these days, are respecting and more and more and more. Of course, you always have, those in the media that are looking to stir up trouble, and you always have those that are going and taking pictures. The question I always wonder, they always complain about those who don't stand during the siren and show you the pictures. Well, who was taking the picture and who was taking the video? Why weren't you standing during the siren? But that's in any event. But source number 36, Rav Yaakov Ariel, who was the chief rabbi from Ramat Gan, one of the leading poskim today in the religious Zionist world, he has a long piece over here in his Mahalashal Torah, which is responsa, where he explains. And again, based on the things that we've said, I think it's worth reading inside, but he explains why this is not a prohibition of Chukot Hagoyim either. According to any of the opinions, he says, source 36. He says, even those things which we would, which make sense, and even according to the Vilna Gaon, who says if we would have thought of it by ourselves, then it's possible we would have thought of it by ourselves, then it would not fall into this category. He says, tzarich ma'adin b'tzvira hanishmat b'yom hazikaron. What would we say about this hara? Sheken yitachen she'af anachnu hayinu magim ledavar ze gam b'ledeihem. It's possible we might have thought of it by ourselves. Omnam en safek shemachar sheyesh lanu minhagah ve'lut mishalanu. Says nonetheless we have our own customs of mourning. We probably wouldn't have come to something else. We would have just learning Mishnayot, saying Kaddish, doing Azkarat. That would have been enough for us. That's what we've been doing for generations. Truth is, in recent years as well, there's more and more. You see this different projects, Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron of extra, learning L'Noi Nishmat, finishing Shas across the world, however many times. This is something which is coming more and more. But he says, so we probably would have thought of that. V'adraba, yesh tam nifgam b'kach. There is something which is not so fitting. She'enanu mistapkim b'minagei shah mekubalim midor dor. That rather than just sticking with our minagim that we've had for every generation, we're looking for new things. V'yotzlim lanu minagim chadashim. And he says, nonetheless, page 117, I'll skip now to where it's in bold. He says, Yitachen, shebatzmenu hayinu magim l'rayon, shamidah b'zman ha'tzfira lichvod ha'noflim mi'aderech ha'neota. He says it's possible that we would have come to this idea. He says, Umar b'kach shelamadnu et haderech hazot me'hagoyim. Why does it matter that although we've learned it from customs in the wider world, it may have been something we thought of ourselves. Harei hamidah lechavod eino davar miyuchad legoyim. Right, the concept of standing up. Right, standing to honor somebody is a universal human concept. Yachas enoshi klali, v'gam anachnu hayinu noagim ken, b'matzav bo anu ntunim, b'voenu l'chapes derech cholemet l'chabet hanoflim shtiyeh mekubel al kol hatzibur. Right, he says you can't ignore the situation that we're in the world, the situation in Am Yisrael nowadays. Right, there are many people that are not Shomrei Torah mitzvot. We're looking for a way which everyone can identify with in order to show respect, and standing up is a way. More than that, we have in our own sources, we have many halachic sources of standing up to show respect for people. In fact, aside for the moment of silence, it's far more common and far more prevalent in the religious Jewish world that people stand up to show honor to somebody than out in the wider world. Right? We have halakha. We have if you skip, you see the third paragraph on page 117. It begins in bold. He says, "Af b'mkomoteinu matzinu amidah lekavod." We found in our own sources this idea. It says stand up for an elderly person, right? I think many times you see on the buses in Israel, right? You have these stickers. It says we stand up for an elderly person. We stand up for a Talmid Chacham. We stand up for the king. We stand up for a Nasi. Whatever it is, you stand up for your parents. Right? There's an achah that when one's parents enter the room, one is meant to stand up. So standing up to show honor for those who have fallen, certainly we can say that it fits in with what we've said in the Torah. Now, even though I'm not sure if he addresses this directly, but Rav Yehuda Herzl Henkin in Tchumen has a ma'amar on the same topic, and he says, although you'd say the sources we found for standing up are standing up if somebody walks in the room and showing honor to somebody who's alive, nonetheless, it's the general concept is appropriate, and that which we've said, that if it's written in the Torah, he proves it from some of the other sources we've seen, that if it's written in the Torah, it is not in the category of Chukot Hagoyim. It doesn't mean necessarily that it's in that exactly that specific application. So long as that general concept is there, then that is enough to say that we can keep that. So certainly, he says that is something that we should do. He invokes also the principles here of Poresh Minat Tzibur, of Eva. Right? Again, if everybody's standing up and you're not, what's it going to do? What's it going to cause? And essentially, the conclusion, page 118, says Rav Yaakov Ariel, Tshuva. So certainly one should stand and be silent during the time of the siren. He says, should not be worried about this. He says, says this is a minhag which has a reason, has a logical reason. And you have many poskim you can rely on for this, etc. Okay. Finally, there are a number of, mentioned last week as well, a number of questions that come up regarding life cycle events, customs of mourning, maybe customs of weddings and things as well, where it seems to be that the customs are taken from the non-Jewish world. Would that be a prohibition? So source, page 119, a couple of details here regarding Hilchot Avelut in terms of mourning. Source 37, Yalkut Yosef, he says, Motala Avelim al Krovehem, Lilbosh B'gadim Shcholim L'siman Evel, Kol Yud Bet Chodesh, V'en B'zeh Mishum B'chukotehem Lo Telechu. Says if one wants to wear black as a sign of mourning, that is something which would be permitted, because we find this, this is an ancient Jewish custom, right? Not so prevalent today, but it's something which exists in our sources, and therefore it is not a prohibition of imitation. If they want to wear a black armband or a black tie or something like that, again, all these make sense, and it's clear that it's a sign of mourning, so therefore it's allowed. Nonetheless, the common practice now is not to do so, and therefore it's not required, and it's better just to wear ordinary clothing. But if one was to wear the black clothes as such, that is not part of this prohibition. He says for the Chevra Kadisha to all come along and take on this minhag, that would seemingly not be appropriate. Source number 38, which is a Sefer Me'olam V'ad Olam, is a contemporary work on Hilchot Avelut by Rabbi Gabriel Goldman, and he addresses there the question of placing flowers on graves. We said last week, the ancient Jewish custom has been to place a rock on a grave. A rock is something which is, over time, it doesn't decay. It stays the same with flowers. You put it there today, but the next day already it's worn out. It's dead. A rock symbolizes eternity, symbolizes netzach, the fact that it's always there. Also, the word even, which is a stone in Hebrew, is a composite of the two words av and ben, right? Father and son. It represents the transfer, the continuation of the generation. This is one of the reasons why we place stones. Nonetheless, if one wants us to place flowers, because that is that's what people do nowadays, is that allowed? So he says, he says there is a certain reticence amongst the poskim about placing flowers on a grave. He says we don't rebuke those who do so. It's not strictly speaking that there is what to rely on. Therefore, he says it's not the preferred practice, but it is but it would be allowed. Yesh poskim shemitnagdim lakach mishum chukot hagoyim. There are poskim who oppose it, who say it would be forbidden. Ach nireh shemeikar din mutar. But it seems that according to the strict letter of the law, it would be allowed. Again, something which is a problem of immodesty, or something which has no reason. These are our two principles which we repeat again and again. That is where it would certainly be prohibited. But over here, since there's a reason one is doing it, it's in order to give honor to the deceased. Again, there is an ancient custom which is mentioned in the Gemara to place hadassim on the grave, and therefore, if one wanted to do so, to place flowers, that would be allowed. He quotes Rav Nerentzal, who says that the Ashkenazi practice is actually to be a bit more stringent and not to place. Talking about flowers, and with this will end, we mentioned last week as well. There is a minhag in many places on Shavuot to decorate the shul with flowers. So is that allowed? So very interesting that the source, probably the earlier source of this minhag, is in the Maharil, and the Maharil writes that we place spices and herbs inside the shul in order for to give a nice fragrance. Right. Following on from that, you find the Ramah, who says that the minhag is to place asavim, to place grass, to place greenery inside the shul. And as over time, as things develop, the Magen Avraham says, not just spices, not just grass, we bring trees. Okay, so it says that's what's brought in the Magen Avraham. As I mentioned last week, the Vilna Gaon was very, very opposed to this. There is a discussion: was the Vilna Gaon just opposed to bringing trees or to bringing any sort of greenery? And again, the Vilna Gaon said there is a non-Jewish practice to bring trees on their festival, right? You're all probably thinking of a certain festival where they bring the trees, but if you look inside, it's actually probably not what the Vilna Gaon was referring to. There was the Chayei Adam. In some copies, some have been censored, but in some copies, he quotes the name of a certain non-Jewish festival they had, which is called Pentecost. He gives it in a different, in the German language. And there was apparently a practice to bring trees into the place of worship. So the Vilna Gaon says no. Sorry?
Palm Sunday.
Palm Sunday, okay. So the Vilna Gaon says no. There are some who understand that the Vilna Gaon was just opposed to bringing trees, and therefore any other types of greenery, the grasses, etc., which is a replication of Ma'amad Har Sinai, that would be allowed. Others, Aruch HaShulchan writes that the Vilna Gaon was opposed to any sort of greenery at all being brought into the shul. But as we said, we saw already that the Vilna Gaon's view in general on Chukot Hagoyim was not accepted. Some places follow his practice, some places not, but each one has what to rely on in our sources. So we'll end it there for today. That is some of the applications. There are many more. And next week, Bezrat Hashem, we'll talk about magic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about attending events where there will be an invocation? Or since let's picture a speech today and quarterly what is actually you know that their prayer is what is getting. Is this going to affect
What is being when you say it's going to be prayer? What is going to be done?
Can you repeat it? Repeat the question.
We put in plastic glasses.
Yeah. So it's done in such a way where it's open,
Close this down.
on the bread and something that can be done.